Hey there, it's Jean with Waldorf-Inspired Learning, and I'm here again for the second time with Janet Langley, one of the authors of The Roadmap to Literacy, a guide to teaching language arts in grades 1 through 3. So this is the second conversation that we're having. So excited. It's actually one in a series of 4 conversations about this book, The Roadmap to Literacy, and how homeschoolers can use this to teach reading and writing and spelling at home. So Janet is a former Waldorf classroom teacher. She took 2 classes all the way through the grades, and now she mentors teachers. And I'm a homeschooling parent. So she has a lot of experience in the classroom. I have a lot of years of experience with homeschooling, and now we're both mentors, and we're having these conversations, which is just so much fun. We also both share a love for language arts and literacy. Before we dive into today's conversation, I just want to remind you that there is a previous interview. So in that very first interview, we talked about, it was kind of an overview of the book and specifically about the 5 phases of literacy. So the phases that children progress through as they're learning to read and write in the early elementary years. So if you haven't had a chance yet, we'll put a link to that first video below in the notes below this one. So like I said, this is the second in a series of 4. And this time we are going to look at just a few specific areas of the book and really lay the groundwork for our next 2 conversations, which are going to dive into planning. So the next video 3, is about planning main lessons, and then video 4 will be about planning practice sessions. So I'm really excited about those 2. And thanks so much, Janet. This is really some rich conversations are coming out of this. So.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for letting me share this knowledge.
Yeah, it's great. So to get us started, Janet, I thought you could just briefly recap what prompted you and your co-author, Jennifer, to write this book. I mean, it's a huge project, right?
Yeah. That project took us over 5 years. And when I started counting, just to get an idea of what we were putting into it, I know we've spent over 14,000 hours in research and writing on the book. So it was definitely a labor of love.
Yes. Yeah. So you've exceeded the, I can't remember which author, but that concept of 10,000 hours, you become an expert. So you're definitely there.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Not to mention, all the years in the classroom. So yeah, tell us just a little bit about the book, and then we will dive into some specifics.
Sure. Well, you mentioned that I had graduated 2 classes, and after doing that, I was going to take a year off to decide what I was going to do next, whether it was to go back in the classroom or something else. And Destiny had a plan for me, and that was to go to a lot of different schools and sit in a lot of classrooms and mentor and evaluate teachers in the classroom. And I spent 5 years doing that, where my suitcase was almost always packed. And I was in classroom after classroom. And what happened as I was doing this is I realized that there really was a challenge that teachers were facing, regardless of their training, regardless of how many years they had taught, their own background, was this challenge of teaching literacy in our classrooms. And the book goes into why teaching literacy is a challenge. In fact, we talked about that in our last video. But what I also realized is not only were teachers spending a tremendous amount of time reinventing the wheel, basically. There wasn't any roadmap for them to follow. And so they were spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to teach, especially the foundational skills, that first through second, third grade year, how to teach these foundational skills to their students. And then I started to realize that in most schools, 30, 40, even sometimes 50% of a class were being pulled out or being recommended for remedial, support in language arts. And I couldn't figure out why that would be, because the parents that find Waldorf, they valued their education. Typically, they're really involved and they're supportive. So I just really didn't understand that. And I was at a school in that 5th year where Jennifer Militzer Cockrell was one of the remedial specialists, and she was working with the students that were being pulled out. And I had the opportunity to have lunch with her, asked her if she had any idea why so many of our students were being pulled out for this tutoring help. And that's when she answered my question by smiling and saying, I've been waiting forever for someone to ask me this question, and it's because English is not German. German being the language of Rudolf Steiner and the original Waldorf school. And
so it's so interesting. Yeah, from a homeschooler's perspective too, that idea of these first 3 years, like we have varying levels of comfort, right, with the idea that that most Waldorf kids are going to be reading fluently more like in 3rd grade, right, as opposed to in a mainstream classroom, let's do it in kindergarten, which is not developmentally appropriate. But still, what can you do other than just wait until 3rd grade, right, for them to start reading? And that's where I think the book really, really shines and comes in, because we need some of these ideas and specific activities to do with our children to be able to foster their literacy skills. Right.
Yeah.
So
yes,
wonderful.
Absolutely. In fact, I just might mention that I had the wonderful opportunity of homeschooling my 2 grandsons in 1st and 3rd grade during this process. So they were my guinea pigs.
That's always good. Yeah.
I learned a lot from them. And I also learned, I really came to an appreciation of the gifts of homeschooling. And that there are definitely things that homeschooling provide the child that a mainstream or a Waldorf classroom does not. So
and they're pros and cons, right, of every setting, but it is good. It's good to have choices and alternatives. Yeah. So let's start diving into the book. And the very first thing, I love this as a starting point because I think this is so clever. Janet shared with me how she prepares the book for the best way to use it, what she's done with the actual physical book. So show us that. Tell us about that.
Right. Well, so as you can see, this book is really 605 pages plus. So it is a tome. However, the book is set out in specific sections. And the first 2 sections of the book really are an introduction and a background. You need to read them to be able to understand and use the rest of the book. But once you've read them, you don't need to carry them around all the time. And so I bound it. You can see. There's not too much to sections 1 and 2 as far as heft goes. So once you've read those, you could put them away. So what I did is I divided the book into 3 sections, and that made it more usable for planning it, for just carrying around if you need it for any other reason. And I chose to bind them differently than I said in the first video. I actually found that binding them in second, 2 sections together and then putting it on the bookshelf after you read it, then sections 3 and 4, which are the heart of the book, the 15 aspects of language arts and the phonics rules section, you almost can reference it daily. Certainly a lot. I mean, if you look at my number of tabs here.
Right.
And then the sections 5 and 6 are about assessment and remediation and planning. And so those, when you're ready to plan, like your block, your lesson, but then it's more helpful for sort of intense planning sessions.
Yeah.
And you don't need it the rest of the time.
Right. So it's like the heart of the center of the book is what you will want to have right there,
right,
with you all the time. The beginning sections are kind of the essential background information, and then some really helpful information about the Waldorf approach itself.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk a little bit about that today, but then the other sections about the different aspects of language arts and the phonics rules are the ones, you have those together or those with the planning?
There's section 3 and 4, and I have those together.
Okay. Yeah.
Because those you might use on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Reference them. The planning is more important when you're actually in a planning.
Right. When you sit
down,
down.
Planning session, either planning out your block, planning out your year.
Yeah. Got it. Yeah, that's super helpful. And I haven't done that yet, but I love that idea. So I think I'm going to do that.
I tell you, for me, even sitting at my desk working on things as I'm looking up items in the book to answer emails or, an article, whatever, it's so much nicer to pick up a book that's not 600 pages every single time.
Right.
So,
and each sort of volume then has a different, you use it a little bit differently.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a great thing to do. So thanks for that. So now we're going to dive a little deeper into the book, and what we're going to talk about are a couple of things that you can have your children do: create their own phonics rules book, work on kid writing and what that does for their literacy development. And then we're going to do sort of the preamble to planning, and we're going to talk about this concept of sacred nothings and responsible innovations before we get into the differences between planning for a main lesson block and planning for a practice session. And then those two topics will be what we'll go more in depth with in the next two videos. So let's start with the phonics rules book. I think this is a really fun thing to have kids do because it gives them real ownership, of the language. So tell us your ideas about that.
So with the phonics rules book, the idea was that every student, after you've introduced the phonics rule that you're teaching, then the student would write down the rule and come up with some, either with you or on their own, come up with some kind of image that would help them. For example, if you were teaching them the vowel team or the digraph of O-O, oo, but also O-O is and like there's boot and there's foot. So, they could draw a picture of a foot and they could draw a picture of a boot right next to it. And those illustrations are in the book. And then they could write the word foot and they could write the word boot, and that would give them an image to anchor those different sounds. And then they would write what the rule is. That's in the book. It gives you exactly the kind of the wording that or they can come up with their own. You can sort of tell them what, maybe the rule that we say, well, how would you say that? And then help them write that. Then something that teachers do a lot, and home parents, teachers too, is I think sometimes we do too much for them. Yeah. We give them too much information. And one of my mentors, Elle Scotkins, who was from Holland, and for decades she came over to the United States and helped teachers. And she kept telling us over and over again, you're doing too much for the children. And so one of the things that she talked about, which also was Steiner also reiterated, is that rather than us give them a list of words that had the oo, the boot oo sound, or the foot sound, what we would do is to have them search either search through books that they're looking at, or maybe we found something that does have a lot of those different words in it, a poem or something, and that they find those examples themselves. And over time, as they're reading, as they're doing their own work, then they're on the lookout for those.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead of just mindlessly copying your list, they are actually creating their own list. And so there's an example of that in chapter 4.1, which is the phonics rules section.
Mm-hmm. And I love that, because I talk to parents all the time about keeping a certain playfulness with words, right, in your lessons or in your day, really, you know. And this is it's sort of like a game of discovery, and you can just have a different focus depending on which phonics rule you're working on at the time, right? And children really, you were saying, children really need to stick with one until they've learned it. So finding different ways, different playful ways, fun ways to do that. It's not fun, you know, but engaging. I think we're encouraging them to do some real thinking about it themselves, so that that then helps them remember.
Yeah. Oh, right? Yeah. I mean, you can, even as you're sort of going about your day, and you as the teacher are looking for examples where, you know, objects where this, you know, these two rules play. So you might say, bedroom, right?
Yeah.
So you can be looking for different examples and to draw the child's attention to, and then also see if they can find examples themselves, and then go write that down in their list. Mm-hmm. So it's just a great idea to get them involved in a lot of different ways of finding these.
And then do you suggest that then the child is just keeping this ongoingly? They have their phonics rules book that they just keep adding to as they learn new rules.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to do a different book for each phase, so there's in section 4 of our book, which is dedicated to phonics rules,
right,
then you could do a book for the phonemic awareness phase, and one for the pattern, and one for the syllable, because truly that's going to take you 3 years of curriculum.
Yeah.
And so you may, I mean, books get beaten up over time, so it's totally your choice.
Yeah, so it's like one for the year, because the 5 phases, just a quick reminder, are, let's see if I can do it, emergent, I'm going to have to, phonemic awareness, pattern, syllable, did I get it right? And then Latin, Greek. So those 3 that Janet was mentioning, those are generally, you're in that for almost a whole year, right?
Right. Well, let's see.
Not quite a whole year.
Phonemic awareness, that phase, which is the first one where we're introducing phonics rules, not just teaching the alphabet, but phonics rules. Yeah. That's that second phase, phonemic awareness. That typically will happen in first grade, maybe a bit of second.
Yeah.
The pattern phase, second grade, maybe a little third. It totally depends on the student.
Right.
Typically, homeschool students can make a little faster progress than a whole class of 30, just because you've got that one-on-one attention.
Right.
And they can't really space out on you.
Yeah.
Like, you know, pretty much if you're engaged in teaching them, you know that, I mean, if they start to gaze out the window, you can, you know, address that. In a classroom of 30 students, if 3 of them are zoning out, you might not particularly be aware of it. So anyway, so then the that's the pattern phase, is mainly second grade curriculum. And then the syllable phase is, as we talked in the first video, is for, you know, third grade, maybe a little bit into fourth grade, for reading, for decoding. But it will take up through probably 6th grade to use and learn all those rules well enough to be able to use them for spelling.
Right.
And that our students, when they get to the point where they can spell any word they can read, about, then we're talking about the completion of the syllable phase.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that overview, that recap there.
Sure.
Because it gives us an idea, right, of what we're focusing on in these different stages and grades. I mean, the great thing about the book is it's by stage, because that's how children learn.
Yes. Yeah.
And so let's move into this idea of kid writing then. And this is another suggestion that you have for creating little books if you want to do it. So I have a couple questions about it, but I'd love to hear you explain it.
So kid writing is something that students can begin maybe after the first consonant block in second grade. It's really once they leave the emergent phase, which you'll need to just learn about that. That learning that letters make sounds.
Yes.
That the letters in a word merge together, and each one represents their sound that creates a word. Once they have that awareness, then they really are ready for the phonemic awareness phase. Even if they haven't learned all the letters of the alphabet, they've got it. Letters represent sounds, and together these letters and the sounds they make words.
Right.
Neurological, understanding. So anyway, once the students get into the phonemic awareness phase, they have enough tools, even if it's maybe 8 or 10 consonants that they actually have been taught formally, but they've got the alphabet up there and they know the alphabet song, and that can help them. And each one has different letters they're aware of because of their name. So what kid writing is it's the child writing a word or a sentence as they progress a paragraph or a little story, using their developing phonemic awareness. So they are using as much as they're able to do to spell a particular word. And it may be that all they know is one letter in the word boat. They know.
Yeah.
Right. And kid writing, as you'll see in the book, it's chapter 3.13. It's in it's one of the aspects of literacy. They what they'll do is you will teach them, introduce this idea of kid writing in such a way that they'll understand that this is not adult writing. This is they're using their best guess at spelling that word, and however they do it is right.
Yeah, and when I was in grad school, it was called invented spelling, right? And you really want to encourage children, right, to do this. And in the Waldorf approach, it's children learn, as many of our listeners know, children learn to read. I mean, children write before they read, and then they often learn to read their own writing. So this development of their own writing that Janet is calling kid writing is so very important, because writing comes before reading.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, L. Scott called it talking on paper.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
Isn't that great?
I saw that. Yeah.
And this is the thing, is that the students or your child is going to be much more interested in writing their own thoughts down. And you can have them talk about what it is they want to write, and maybe come down to an idea of what it is that I want to say, and then use their best guess in writing whatever that is. And you give them methods using a blank line if they don't know what a letter is, or they don't know even how to spell the word. And they can also, it's a great opportunity to start using sight words. And we talk about how to begin working with sight words at the beginning of first grade. And there's many, many reasons to do that.
Yeah. Great.
Including neurologically taking advantage of the fact that students at this point, they memorize words by sight. Like they know their name. You know their name, Amy, by how it looks, not the fact that it's made up of these 3 letters, each having these sounds.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, which is why so many kids our first awareness that they can read is that they recognize logos.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, right.
Because
Absolutely.
that is a stage. They're just memorizing the image of it.
Yeah. And if you think about the word the or of, you will never be able to sound those out. Right? They have to be truly memorized as a visual experience. Mm-hmm. So, and students are primed for that at the beginning of first grade. They've been doing that for a long time. Right. So, so they can, in their kid writing, they can use the sight words that they've learned. They can use their best guess, and the kid writing will get more and more sophisticated as each child learns more and more phonics rules, and that they or letters, and sounds. So that'll just develop. And the wonderful thing is that if you're teaching, say for example, you have a first and a second grader homeschooler. Mm-hmm. Well, each child you can give them a kid writing assignment, and each child can do that assignment at his or her own level. Mm-hmm. And so it's a way to differentiate that is very easy. And you'll be surprised. And this is Els Godkin's telling us we do too much for our kids. We used to think that if we wrote these beautiful sentences, well-constructed sentences on the board and had the students copy them, that then they would learn to be good writers. Mm-hmm. And so if you often go into a Waldorf classroom in first, second, third grade and beyond, I've even seen it in fifth, mm-hmm. And all of the students' books look the same. Right. Or if your child's main lesson book looks just like yours, mm-hmm. as far as not the drawings, but the text, mm-hmm. then basically I'm not going to say they're mindlessly copying you, but they're not invested in copying those words. They're just copying it down, sometimes just verbatim, not even thinking about it. Right. Now, if you focus on handwriting, then it is a handwriting exercise.
Right, exactly. Well, so I love this quote from the book, and this comes from, I think it's from Trostley's Rhythms of Learning, mm-hmm. but this quote from Rudolf Steiner, right? He said this in Discussions with Teachers, which is one of, most of my readers know this, but one of 3 books that are the foundation of training, right? Yep. So these are the lectures that Steiner gave to those very first teachers 100 years ago, come August.
Over a period of 2 weeks.
Over a period of just 2 weeks. I always talk about that story. Such a great story. Yes. 2 weeks, open a school.
Yep.
So here's what Steiner said about this very thing. Quote, "If we proceed rationally, we will get far enough in the first grade so that children will be able to write simple things that we say to them, or that they compose themselves." First grade. "If we stick to simple things, the children will also be able to read them."
Yes.
And I just think that's so helpful. I get questions all the time, and I've had the same experience where I know of some homeschooling parents, they think this is what they're supposed to be doing, but they're still in 4th and 5th grade composing summaries and having the children copy them.
Right.
And it, it's a gradual process, but we definitely, I think as homeschooling parents, make that same mistake of trying to do too much for our children. So my question for you then is the combination of like what this looks like, because you're suggesting kids make their own little book of kid writing. Mm-hmm. But then talk about how that relates to main lesson book summaries,
right? And
kind of where you see the difference between those.
Okay, so with kid writing, often what a teacher will do or a parent will do is to give the student a topic to write about.
Mm-hmm.
And first of all, especially in first grade, or, you know, in when they're quite young, you say, for example, you ask them to write about their dog, the family dog.
Mm-hmm.
And that first of all, they're going to draw a picture of their dog. Now, this isn't going to be a great main lesson masterpiece. This is going to be a little kind of sketch, right? But a little picture of their dog. And then they're going to write it might be just the name of the dog at the very beginning.
Yes.
Or
like
it might be the title.
Yeah.
And then, or it might be a title and one brief little sentence about their dog.
Yeah.
Okay. So then you always want them to put the date or of their writing.
Yeah.
And then and you can do these as single pieces of paper, but then bind them or, you know, punch holes in them and string them together or something, but you create little books.
Yeah.
And it's just phenomenal when the students at the end of the year go back and look at their beginning writing. They can't believe it, that they ever wrote that poorly. You know, but this is something Steiner always talks about, is that at the end of your school year, you definitely want to review the school year, and so that the students can really see, oh, I've actually really learned something this year.
Yeah.
I mean,
and at home, I encourage homeschooling parents to get in the habit of that by having a little recap at the end of the week, then at the end of the block, and again at the end of the year.
That's great.
It is a habit that we need to develop, but we so often forget to do that. And the child can really take in the progress that they are making.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And in fact, you could probably gently meld those two together for an assessment. You know, to see how they're progressing. Yeah. So that's
nice.
That's great. So that's with kid writing. They're creating these books, and they're doing their own. They sort of, you know, they do a little drawing, and then they write about the drawing. So they're illustrating it, and then with main lesson books, this is where the parent can go ahead and maybe you found a poem about, or you've made up a poem yourself about the fairy tale, or whatever it is you're teaching. You might write something, and your child does copy that, understanding that really what's happening there is you're giving them something that you can then use in a lesson to go back and say, okay, in what we wrote yesterday, put your finger, Leah, show me the word the. Our sight word the, our friendly word, right? Or how many of the words there begin with the k sound, or whatever. I mean, you can use it as a teaching tool. Yeah. Right. And also in main lesson books, we do really ask them to use their best handwriting. And it's their best work. Yeah. Yes. And I have to say something really quickly. Over the past year, I have been working with RAND Corporation. That's RAAND Corporation, who makes a lot of the Waldorf main lesson books and Waldorf teaching materials. There's Mercurius and there's RAND. And I've been working with them to develop lined main lesson book pages, so that on one side it's blank for an illustration, on the other side it is it's lined, and there's there's a first grade level and a second grade, and it's got that dotted midline. And if you want to color in those divisions, it's got room for a title. It also has it's bordered all the way around with a line, so the students don't write off the page. But I think they're wonderful, because you're giving students the tools they need to be able to practice their best handwriting. Yeah. And, to practice this relationship between which letters are tall, which ones are medium, which ones go into the ground.
And it has the format there. I get that question so often. And I will say to parents, it's okay for you to draw the lines. You know, if your child, it can't, you know, some children write so large that they can't fit what they want to on a page, or some children write teeny tiny, or whatever it is, or it's so slanted. So in those cases, that little bit of direction or correction is very helpful.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, well, in our handwriting chapter, which is 3.2, we talk a lot about how important it is. In fact, one of the sacred nothings that Christoph talked about, and Christoph Wiechert, was this giving the child a blank white page and expecting, and they have this expectation that they're supposed to write as beautifully as you do, or you know, he said it's actually, it can cause fear in their heart
and anxiety.
And
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
Yes, I can't.
So that's a good segue. We're gonna get to sacred nothings in a second, but I just have one more thing that I really want to point out that I love. So if you have the book, in that section on kid writing, it's on page 303, there is this chart that has samples of kid writing by phase.
Yes.
So helpful. And then little signposts and suggested mini lessons that go with it. So it looks like this, and it will give an example of, say the child is writing, I made big frozen waffles. So it might just be the word made is spelled MD, right? Yeah. And big is BG, or it could, you know, be that made is spelled MAD. That's another phase. So that is really helpful for you if you want to. It's a kind of way of assessing, but then also designing how you might work with them based on where their kid writing is right now, you know, wherever they are. So that I thought was really helpful. I wanted to mention that. So we are going to get into this conversation about sacred nothings, which I just think is so fascinating. And I actually first discovered this from Stephen Keith Sagarin. He's a high school Waldorf teacher on the East Coast, but he called them Waldorf myths. But it all comes from, I think, from Christoph Wiechert talking about, there are some questionable practices in Waldorf classrooms, and often as homeschoolers we're copying what's happening in a Waldorf classroom, right? And many of the Waldorf classroom teachers are doing what they were taught, right, in their trainings. So some of these sacred nothings, and we'll talk a little bit more, some examples in a second, some of them I think are simply questionable, like are they related to something Steiner said or not? But some of them, Wiechert is saying, some of them are even counterproductive. Right. So there are examples. I talk all the time about circle time, because circle time is really hard to do at home, right?
Yes, I know.
Children feel so self-conscious, and some children then act out as a result. Some, you know, it's a whole, but I love that Wiechert says, whatever opening you're going to do, whatever warm up you're going to do, keep it to 15 minutes. And that's what I've said for so long. Like 10 to 20 minutes is what you're aiming for. And if it's not working at all, light a candle and say a verse.
Yes, absolutely.
And start your lesson, right? But so I'd love to hear your take on sacred nothings, and then we're gonna get into one real specific example related to planning here in a minute.
Okay. So just to reiterate from the first conversation, Christoph Wiechert was director of the pedagogical section for 9 or 10 years. And that's really the organization that oversaw or oversees Waldorf education in the world. So the fact that he was director of that organization gives you an idea that he has really delved into this in a very, very deep way. And he also was a class teacher for 30 some odd years. He himself was a Waldorf student in Holland. So anyway.
And he travels and does trainings,
Yes.
and is very involved in.
Yes, still, even though he retired a number of years ago,
yes.
he's still very, very active in supporting Waldorf education around the world. In fact, I was just with him in February in Boulder when he was the keynote speaker, and I was bringing this literacy information to the Rocky Mountain Regional Conference in Boulder. So anyway, what happened was that when Christoph became director of the pedagogical section, he began to travel the world visiting Waldorf schools, and he certainly came to the United States. And he was in classroom after classroom, state after state, school after school, and he kept seeing teachers doing the same things. And his question was, why are you doing that? Because it wasn't anything that he was familiar with, being Waldorf, being, having its root in Steiner's teachings.
Right.
And he basically, he said some of these things he just thought were a waste of time. Or he really didn't understand why teachers were spending time doing this. Then there were, like you said, there were some things that he was watching teachers do that he really thought were counterproductive, maybe even harmful to the developing child. So he started collecting these and talking to teachers and finding out that, well, they did this because that's what they were taught. And I have to tell you, part of this journey for me personally is sort of trying to make it right, because I was one of those teachers in teacher training that was propagating a lot of these sacred nothings, because that's how I was taught, and I was just passing it on. Right. So this is kind of a bit of contrition. These 14,000 hours. So anyway, so he really became concerned enough about this that he wrote a series of articles in the Pedagogical Journal, an international periodical that addresses them.
Right.
And because I had attended a conference where he talked about these back in maybe, 2004 or something, I really jumped on board, because what he was saying just rang so true to me in so many different levels. And I began to really question what I was doing and why I was doing it. Make sure that I was conscious of my choices. And not just blindly following, especially when I really had the inner sense that that wasn't right for my class.
Well, that's so interesting, because for me it was as a homeschooling parent, I first came to these, and I also have a teaching degree, so I would think, I'm not so sure, and then I'd get really curious and go back to, well, what exactly did Steiner say? Like because this is an interpretation, and then sort of that idea of a folk evolution, right? We're passing on from teacher to teacher to teacher to teacher. It eventually ends up in this practice. It's like the game of telephone. But what exactly did Steiner tell those very first teachers that set this in motion? So, I
think for when you talk about sort of really paying attention to your child and what the child is saying, when I was homeschooling my first grader, I was really grappling with this idea of introducing lower and uppercase letters together, which Jennifer was, kept telling me this is what makes sense for the learning child, and she had many reasons why we should be doing that, but I hadn't been taught that way. But then when I went back and I started really looking at what Steiner had done when he was, as you'll see in the book, in one lecture, he's introducing the letter F. He starts out with a picture of the fish. And it sort of morphs into something that's more of a gesture of a fish. Then it morphs into the lowercase f of the German. And then from that, you form the uppercase F of the German. So this was taught in a progression where the lowercase actually came before the uppercase. And then he shows the same thing with the letter I. And so right in front of us, it was there, but we were very caught in our sacred nothing about only introducing uppercase letters and introducing every single one of them out of the image, which, like you said before, Steiner said, do 8 or 10 and then move on, you know, out of this image. They don't all need to do that. At some point, your child will go, oh, and this is that difference between the emergent and the phonemic awareness phase. Mm-hmm. Oh, letters represent sounds. And after,
like you can see it.
Right? Yes, and then at that point they'll just take your word that this is the letter R, and this is the uppercase and the lowercase, the adult and the baby, or the child letter, and they make the sound. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the one that, well, so there are a couple examples of these sacred nothings, right? Like I said, circle time. The idea of doing a block of form drawing to start first grade. I have just always told people you don't need to do that. I don't know where that comes from. But
we don't know other than maybe teachers didn't know what to teach. So
and
they like that.
I don't know. Because form drawing is best brought once a week, right? But let's talk about this 3-day rhythm. I really want to talk a little bit about this together, because I also, this is one of those Waldorf practices that I work at debunking.
Good for you.
Yeah. So, tell us about your experience with that.
Okay, so certainly back in 1990 when I was doing my training, I was taught that we always taught everything in a 3-day rhythm. Mm-hmm. And I certainly propagated that for way too many years. And really, when we go back to what Steiner was saying, which is amazing that over 100 years ago, he was talking about the importance of using the night, of teaching a new concept and then sleeping on it before you did anything really cerebral with it, right? Yep. And now if you actually spend any time researching the relationship of sleep to learning, you'll find out that there's a lot of neurological research and evidence out there that basically says they're not quite sure how sleeping supports learning, but it definitely does. Yeah. And we have some research in the book about that, and I hear stuff every couple of months.
Me too. And it's remarkable because it was 100 years ago, right? And just this idea, I was first introduced to it years ago, probably in grad school, with the idea that children are still learning even when they're not on task. Right. And so now that's evolved into, letting something rest for a while and coming back to it. You're often further ahead than you were when you stopped, right? And so there's something about integration that happens, right, neurologically, that sleep brings. But what that does for this concept of the 3-day rhythm is say, what we really need then is at least a 2-day rhythm. It doesn't mean we need to stretch this out over 3 days, right?
Yeah. And in fact, you'll find that certainly in Waldorf classrooms, the upper grades teachers, they go to a 2-day rhythm really fairly quickly. And in fact, but the thing about the rhythm, it really depends on what you're teaching.
Yes, definitely does. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're just introducing a new concept, like the idea of nouns in 2nd grade, which is actually when Steiner said we should be doing it, that you introduce the concept and you're going to be working with it for a while, but you're going to be working with the concept of nouns and the nuances of nouns for years, right? And so you could use a 3-day rhythm if that works in your schedule for introducing a noun, and then you can move on and introduce the verb. which is also second grade, and different language mechanics aspects, like what makes a complete sentence. Anyway, all of that is in the grammar chapter, in the third section of our book. For let's see, that one would be for second grade. And grammar is taught by grade, actually not by phase. But because it doesn't have to do with reading. The phases are really about reading and spelling, decoding and encoding. This is by grade. But anyway, you can use a 3-day rhythm there. Because you're going to continually practice it, come back to it, use it in your compositions. You're going to be working with it for years. However, with phonics rules they're like math in that you would not introduce columnar addition, which is 34 plus 78 plus 62 plus 21 plus before you introduced 5 plus 7 in a column, right? And so phonics rules are like that, in that when you go to our section 4 on phonics rules, you'll see every phonics rule has prerequisites. Right. And those prerequisites are the phonics rules that really this child needs to know, and that you need to teach before you move on to this next one. And so there are some phonics rules that will take a couple of weeks to learn. And you don't want to move on. And we did this way too often. In fact, it's being done way too often today in classrooms, is that the teacher will introduce a phonics rule, practice it for 3 days, the 3-day rhythm, and then move on to the next one. And what happens is down the line, these students have huge holes in their phonemic awareness. They turn out to be terrible spellers.
And at home, we have the luxury of staying with it. You do. As long as needed. We don't have to stick to the what's best for the whole large group of children. So that's a very it's great. And you also have you have the connection with your child. That you also know when that child's reached. Not mastery, but being able to use that rule to decode maybe 80% of the time. And without doing a formal assessment. It's often just clear by observation, right? And then you can move on. You don't have to keep them practicing the same thing because most of the class still doesn't have it. That you can truly just proceed through the phonics curriculum at this pace that you and your child's at. Which is great. That is great. So just to wrap this piece up, the idea then, the corollary term to sacred nothings is responsible innovation. So the idea is to ask yourself questions like, is this practice or this approach grounded in Steiner's indications, or does it come from somewhere else, right? Is it influenced by something else? And is it serving the child? Is it developmentally appropriate? I mean, there are a series of questions actually in that chapter in the book that can help you, help parents assess, whether a particular practice makes sense or is worthy of responsible innovation. So,
right. Exactly. In fact, we mentioned Else Godkins earlier, and one of the things she brought to our movement that was a responsible innovation was free rendering. And it has to do with review, has to do with practice, and there's a section in the comprehension chapter of the book that which describes free rendering. And certainly Steiner never wanted the teacher, be it parent, class teacher, or whatever, to only do what he said. And he wanted us to educate our child for their time, to be successful and be able to meet the challenges of their time. And we know that the challenges of our children today are very different than the challenges of those children that were living right after post-World War I Germany. And so we need to make sure that our education is preparing the children to be successful for their future. And that is going to require responsible innovations.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, absolutely. And my mentor, Barbara Dewey, who was a homeschooling mentor to me and to lots of other parents, homeschooling parents, she would always say, you know, Steiner said that the teachers, all of us as teachers, we need to be people of the world. We need to embrace the changes, and we need to bring to our children exactly that, you know, what they're going to need to navigate, to bring their gifts to the world, to, you know, help make the world a better place. So definitely important thing to think about. So just to wrap up here because the next two interviews, as I said at the beginning, are going to be about planning, some real specifics on planning main lesson blocks or main lessons themselves, and then planning practice sessions. So just to give us a little, to wrap up today and as a segue into the next interview, how would you describe the difference between those two?
Between main lesson and practice.
And practice sessions.
Right. Right. Well, the main lesson, of course, is the heart of the Waldorf curriculum, and it's something that we do for the first 2 hours every morning. And Steiner, I mean, the reason we do it then is because Steiner said that developmentally the child is the most awake, the most receptive for learning those first 2 hours in the morning, and we should take advantage of that. And I, after all those years, I can say that is definitely true. They're more awake then than they are in the afternoon for that academic learning. But so the main lesson is where we introduce new concepts.
Right.
This is where we can bring our creativity to the stories we choose, the poems, the tongue twisters, the projects, the activities, everything. We are helping introduce new ideas and connecting the children to their world in a new way.
Yep.
And so that is the main lesson. And however, when it comes to skills, which is what math and language arts are in the first 3 grades, these are the foundational skills that we are teaching that are going to underline all the rest of their learning for the rest of their lives. I mean, as far as academic learning. And you can't even read a math story problem if you don't know how to read. Right? So anyway, our task in main lessons in 1st through 3rd grade is to teach these skills. And skills are different than subjects. And we talked about this in the last segment, I mean in our first segment, is that botany, you can learn enough about botany as a teacher in 5th grade to introduce the idea of, you know, the study of botany and be creative about it and informative, but it's only an introduction. It's a general, you know, it's a general introduction. So, but with these foundational, and also children don't have to practice botany every day to be good at it and to understand it, right?
Yeah.
But with skills, the way children learn skills is by practice and ongoing practice. So we may introduce a subject, I mean a topic, a new concept in the main lesson, but say for example nouns and verbs, but we need to continue to practice them. And we need to continue to practice spelling. And how do we spell sight words? We need to continue to practice these phonics rules. How do you decode using, you know, the digraphs of CH, SH, WH. So we have to design a curriculum that allows for the creative introduction of these new ideas in main lesson blocks, in a main lesson block. But then once that main lesson block ends in language arts and we shift over to math, then later in the day, preferably in the morning, but after main lesson, we're giving the children the opportunity to practice the language arts that they learned in the block before.
Yeah, and so that is the simplest way, I think, to understand it, is that when we're in a math main lesson block, we can be practicing language arts skills briefly in a practice session afterward. And then when we're in a language arts block or a humanities block, right, history or whatever, then we can be practicing math after. So we're going to talk about how to plan for both of those, right? We're going to talk about how to plan for main lessons and how to plan practice sessions.
Yeah, so that'll be great.
Yeah, I look forward to that.
Yeah. I want to say one thing, that I think that my experience with homeschooling is similar in a way to what I experienced in the classroom, which is that practice, teachers, be they parents or Waldorf classroom teachers, spend so much time developing these creative, exciting main lessons that they really don't have any more time left over for designing effective, creative, differentiated practice classes. And also, in fact, in my training, and this was true as of 3 years ago at Rudolph Steiner College, there wasn't even an hour and a half lesson on how to plan a practice class.
In the homeschooling world too, it's a new conversation that's happening. And a lot of people are wondering how to do it and where to fit it in and what it looks like. So it will be very helpful.
Yes. And there's a way we can do it that's not extremely time consuming, but very effective.
Yeah, I mean, it can be 30 minutes and it's and that can really make a huge difference.
It can.
So that's so great. Thank you so much, Janet.
You are welcome.
Wonderful.
Again, always enjoy talking with you about this topic that we both love.
Thank you.
And it's so important.
Yes, and it's so important. So thanks so much, Janet. And thanks everybody for listening and watching. And we hope to see you in the next couple of interviews when we dive into planning the lessons. So
yes, absolutely.
All right. Thanks so much. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.